Hello, and welcome to the 14th in this series of programs on foundational concepts in economics. What we're looking at here is the idea of stated preferences and revealed preferences. Now, in order to explain this, we need to first of all say something about what we mean by preference. A preference is to say that confronted with a choice between at least two options, A and B, which are either mutually exclusive, so that to have one you have to give up the other completely, or which have to be traded off to some degree, people will tend to choose one rather than the other. In that case, you would say that they have a preference for one option. You cannot have a preference unless you are making a choice. So this is a concept that only applies to decision making between alternative courses of action. You can't have it in a meaningful sense otherwise. And also, the choices that you're making have to be ones that involve a cost in some sense or other. You either have to give up something in order to do something. So it's obviously a very important concept in economics, given the centrality of the notion of opportunity cost to economic thinking. Now, given this importance of preference, the big question, of course, is how do you find out what it is that people prefer? If you want to explain why people behave the way they do, or to draw conclusions from the way they behave, one thing you need to know is what is it that they prefer? Given a choice between A and B, would you say that people will go for A or B? What are their preferences? And obviously, it would help if you could judge roughly what those preferences are before the choice is made. But as we'll see, this is actually much more difficult than you might imagine. Now, there are two ways of finding out what people's preferences are. The first thing is that you can ask them. You can basically put a questionnaire to them and say, given a choice between eating ice cream and eating custard, which would you rather do? And people will then tell you what the answer is. Now, the answers you get from this are what are called stated preferences, because you derive those preferences from people's statements as to what it is they prefer. In this case, you're able to get an idea of what people's preferences are before the event, because you can ask people what choice they would make in a decision, a trade-off, before they've actually had to make that choice. And so stated preferences are future-oriented in some sense. You can actually find them before people do something. The other thing you can do is that after the event, you can actually observe what people do when they're actually confronted with the choice. These are called revealed preferences because they are the preferences that are actually made apparent or revealed by what people actually do. Now, the two things don't always match up. Sometimes you find that people say they prefer A to B, and in the event they do actually choose A for B. But very often they don't. There's very often a significant mismatch between what people say they would prefer and what their actual actions show that they prefer, because they actually choose something which they previously told you they wouldn't choose. The classic example of this in politics is where people say that they would prefer to have a certain level of public spending, but when it comes to voting, they vote for candidates who say that they will not give this public spending, but will promise lower taxes. And in that case, their revealed preference, the preference they've expressed by their voting choice, is not the same as the one that they have stated. And so what this means is that in many cases, you have to only judge what people's preferences are after the event. You cannot rely with anything like 100% accuracy on what they say they would prefer. Now, what economists pretty much universally say is that it is revealed preferences that matter, not stated preferences. Stated preferences are interesting perhaps, but if you want to actually explain the world, to understand the world, what you have to go on are the revealed preferences. They're the ones that actually count. Now, what this is, it's important to understand what economists mean by saying that revealed preferences what matter, not stated preferences are. They're not saying that revealed preferences are real and stated preferences are not. In other words, what they are not saying is that people who state that they prefer A to B but then go on to choose B rather than A are actually lying about their stated preference. They're not saying that there is something delusional about the stated preference and that therefore the stated preference should be regarded as unreal. In one sense, both stated and revealed preferences are equally real in the abstract philosophical sense. What the economists are making is a different point. Revealed preferences are preferences that take costs into account. In other words, you could summarize the difference between stated preferences and revealed preference for economists by saying that talk is cheap. Anyone can say that they would prefer something because talking about something bears no costs. Once you have to actually choose, you have to take costs, particularly opportunity costs, into account. And that's the point at which the revealed preference comes into play. So in other words, the reason why revealed preferences are the ones that matter is that revealed preferences are the preferences that reflect the choices people make when they have to actually take costs into account and think about the cost of what it is that they're doing. One classic example would be this. Many people will say, oh, I would love to play a musical instrument, speak a foreign language, but they haven't actually done it. What that tells you is that maybe they do want to play a musical instrument or speak a foreign language, but they're not prepared to incur the costs that would go with actually doing that. And therefore, when push comes to shove in the real world of costs and benefits, they don't really want to do it, not at a cost that they would have to meet. Similarly, the voters who say that they would like higher levels of public spending are not prepared to pay the taxes that would make the level of public spending they do actually want feasible. And therefore, because they're not prepared to do that, their real preference, their revealed preference, if you will rather, is that they don't want it. So revealed preference are the data that economists and sociologists use to actually study the world. It's revealed preferences that tell you how people have chosen in the past when confronted by choices that have costs attached to them, and thus they give you an idea about how people will act in the future. The tricky thing is that the relationship can change when one of two variables change. It may be that costs change, or it may be that subjective valuations change, in which case people may actually think that they are now prepared to face the costs. So revealed preferences tell you how people have behaved in the past. They give you, therefore, an idea about how they will behave in the future, but you have to always qualify that by thinking that something may change. But what this is the most reliable guide we have to what it is that people will actually do when they're forced to confront the costs of the choices that they're making.